Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe and support me. Dr. Ethan Caldwell stared at the data blinking across his screen, his brow furrowed in confusion. He had been tracking a faint, rhythmic anomaly coming from a distant region of the cosmos for weeks now, but the numbers made no sense. The signal wasn't random. It wasn't cosmic background radiation, nor was it interference from any known source. It was too consistent, too steady, like the beat of a heart. He tapped his fingers against the desk in a matching rhythm, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. He had been working late nights alone in the university observatory, scouring the data, cross-referencing it with previous findings, and even sending messages to colleagues in other observatories to confirm what he was detecting. Nothing explained this pulsation. "It's like a heartbeat," Ethan muttered to himself, rubbing his eyes. It pulsed at regular intervals, steady and unwavering. No other known celestial phenomena behave like this. Supernova remnants, pulsars, black holes, they all had patterns, but none as perfect, as alive as this. Ethan sighed and stood up, stretching his arms over his head. His office was cluttered with piles of papers, coffee-stained mugs, and glowing computer monitors filled with more data than he could process. His colleague, Dr. Naomi Sinclair, had already dismissed the signal as nothing more than an unremarkable quirk in the data. "It's just noise, Ethan," she had said a week ago, shaking her head when he brought it up. "There's no point wasting your time on something that's likely just interference." But Ethan couldn't let it go. Something about the pulse pulled at him. It was too perfect, too deliberate. He had never encountered anything like it before, not in his 20 years of studying the stars. With a frustrated groan, Ethan left his office and stepped outside to the observatory's rooftop. The night air was crisp, the sky clear, and the stars glittered like diamonds against the velvet backdrop of space. He breathed deeply, his gaze fixed on the heavens. Somewhere out there, millions of light years away, this pulse originated. Was it a natural phenomenon, or something more? He looked down at his phone and considered calling Naomi again, but he knew how the conversation would go. She would brush him off, tell him to focus on more pressing matters, like their upcoming research grant renewal. But this pulse had burrowed into his mind, refusing to be ignored. Instead, he dialed a different number. "Hello?" A sleepy voice answered. "Lucas, it's Ethan. Sorry to call so late." There was a rustling on the other end as Lucas, his postdoc, woke up. "Ethan, it's nearly midnight. What's going on?" "I need you to look at some data I've been analyzing. There's a pulsy rhythmic signal. I've been tracking it for weeks. I can't explain it, but it's there, and it's consistent." Lucas groaned. "Are you sure it's not just interference?" "I'm sure. I've cross-checked it with every dataset I can find. It's coming from a specific region of the galaxy, and it's unlike anything I've ever seen." There was a pause. "All right," Lucas finally said, his curiosity piqued. "Send me the data. I'll look at it in the morning." "Thanks, Lucas, I appreciate it." Ethan hung up and looked back up at the stars. The pulse was out there, somewhere, waiting to be understood. The next morning, Ethan sat at his desk, staring at a fresh pot of coffee and the mountain of data still flashing on his screens. His mind drifted to Leah, his daughter. He hadn't spoken to her in weeks. Ever since their argument, the silence between them had grown unbearable. She had accused him of caring more about his work than his family, and maybe she was right. He had poured everything into his research for as long as he could remember. Even when Leah's mother left, Ethan had buried himself in his work, using the stars as an escape. But now Leah was grown, living in a different city, and their relationship felt like the very data Ethan was analyzing a distant, cold, unexplainable. He snapped back to reality as Lucas barged into his office, holding a tablet. "Ethan, you were right." Ethan's eyes lit up. "You found something?" Lucas nodded, dropping the tablet onto Ethan's desk. "The pulse is real. I analyzed the data all night. It's not interference, And it's not background radiation, it's coming from a specific point in space, and it's rhythmic. But there's something else. Lucas hesitated. It changes. Changes? Ethan frowned. It reacts, Ethan. I tested it with different frequencies, and it seems to shift subtly, like it's resonating with something. I don't know what, but it's not a static signal. It's alive. Ethan's heart raced. Alive. That word hit him harder than he expected. Was this pulse not just a natural phenomenon but something sentient? Could the universe itself be communicating in some way? I need more data, Ethan muttered, pacing. We need to expand the range, gather more readings. We also need funding, Lucas added grimly. We're on thin ice with a board, and they won't be too happy if we don't present something concrete soon. Ethan waved a hand dismissively. We'll figure that out. This policy, it's bigger than any grant. If we're right, this could change everything. Lucas glanced at the scattered papers on Ethan's desk and the disheveled look in his mentor's eyes. Just don't lose yourself in this, all right? The pulse. It's strange. It affects you. What do you mean? Ethan asked. When I was running tests on the data, I felt calm, like everything around me didn't matter as much. It's hard to explain. It's like the pulse quiets the noise in your head. It's subtle, but it's there. Ethan froze, remembering the way the pulse had seemed to settle his own mind during his late night sessions. It wasn't just in the data, it was in him. We're onto something, Lucas, he said softly. And we're going to figure out what it means. Days turned into weeks as Ethan and Lucas immersed themselves in their research. They expanded their observations, collecting data from other observatories, and the pulse became clearer. It was undeniable now. It resonated at a frequency that affected not just the equipment but also the human mind. Ethan began to suspect that the pulse was tied to human emotions, like an invisible thread connecting the universe to the heart of every person. The more Ethan delved into the mystery, the more obsessed he became. His office became a labyrinth of data streams and hypotheses scribbled on whiteboards. The pulse had seeped into his very being, dominating his thoughts. He found himself lying awake at night, listening to recordings of the pulse, feeling it sync with his own heartbeat. It was soothing, like a lullaby from the cosmos. One evening, after another long day of research, Ethan found himself alone in his office. The rest of the team had gone home, and the building was eerily quiet. He sat at his desk, headphones on, listening to the pulse as he sifted through the latest data. Suddenly, a message popped up on his screen. It was from Leah. Dad, can we talk? Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't heard from her in months. The last time they spoke, she had been angry that he missed her art exhibition. Angry that he never seemed to care about anything outside of his work. Of course, he typed back, his fingers trembling. I've been meaning to call. There was a pause, and then her reply came. I'm sorry I was so harsh. I feel like you're so far away sometimes. Even when we're in the same room, you're miles away, lost in your work. Ethan's chest tightened. She was right. He had spent so much of his life chasing the stars that he had let his own daughter drift away. I'm sorry too, Leah. I've been a terrible father. I don't know how to fix that, but I want to try. For a moment, there was silence. Ethan held his breath, waiting for her response. When it finally came, it was like a lifeline. I want to try too. The conversation with Leah lingered in Ethan's mind as he continued his research. The pulse had given him something beyond scientific discovery. It had brought him a sense of clarity, of peace. It was as if the universe itself was urging him to reconnect, not just with his daughter, but with his own emotions. As Ethan shared his findings with his team, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the verge of something monumental. The pulse was more than just a scientific anomaly. It was a reflection of something deeper, perhaps even a glimpse into the very nature of life itself. But not everyone saw it that way. The university board, frustrated by the lack of tangible results, began to pressure Ethan to shift focus back to more conventional research. Funding was running low, and the skepticism from his peers grew louder. We need proof, Ethan, Naomi said during one tense meeting. This pulse might be fascinating, but without something concrete, we're going to lose everything. Ethan nodded, though his mind was elsewhere. He knew they were on the cusp of a breakthrough. He could feel it. But proving it to the world, that was another challenge altogether. Ethan sat in his office late one evening, staring at the data on his screen. His mind was swimming with thoughts of Leah and the progress they had made, however small. The pulse was still running through his head, steady, rhythmic, like the beat of his own heart. The more he listened, the more he felt connected to Ida, not just as a scientist but as a human being. There was something deeply personal about the way it seemed to calm him, how it made everything else fall away, leaving only the pulse and his own breath. Leah's words from their last conversation echoed in his mind. He had always been so focused on the cosmos, on what lay beyond, that he'd lost sight of what mattered here on Earth. For the first time, he wondered if the pulse was showing him more than just a scientific phenomenon. Was it showing him how to reconnect with the people around him? The next few days were a blur of activity. Ethan and Lucas worked around the clock, pushing their research further. They refined their experiments, using volunteers from the psychology department to study how the pulse affected emotions. The results were astonishing. Volunteers reported feeling calmer, more at peace, and more connected to their emotions after listening to the pulse. It was as if the universe itself was helping them unlock something within. But there was more. As they dug deeper, they discovered that the pulse didn't just affect emotions, it seemed to amplify them. Volunteers who were experiencing sadness or grief reported feeling those emotions more intensely at first, only for the pulse to soothe them, like waves crashing against the shore and then receding. It was a cycle, a rhythm that reflected the ebb and flow of human emotion. Ethan was fascinated, but also cautious. The pulse was powerful, and he wasn't sure if they fully understood its potential. As more volunteers participated in the experiments, one, in particular, stood out: a veteran named Marcus who had been struggling with PTSD. Marcus had been hesitant at first, but after a few sessions, he opened up to Ethan and Lucas about how the pulse made him feel. "It's like, I don't know how to explain it," Marcus said one afternoon, sitting across from Ethan in the lab. "It's like the pulse gets inside my head, and all the noise. It just quiets down. All the bad memories, the panic, it's like they're still there, but they don't have the same hold on me. I can finally breathe." Ethan nodded, his heart pounding. Marcus's reaction was exactly what he had hoped for, yet it also made him uneasy. The pulse was doing something profound, something beyond what any of them had anticipated. "It's almost like the universe is trying to tell us something," Ethan mused aloud, more to himself than to Marcus. Marcus smiled, a faint glimmer of peace in his eyes that Ethan hadn't seen before. "Maybe it is." But not everyone was responding so positively. Dr. Lucas, who had been one of Ethan's most enthusiastic supporters, began to change. He became obsessed with the pulse, listening to it for hours at a time. Ethan noticed Lucas's behavior becoming more erratic. He was agitated, easily frustrated, and seemed to lose focus during their research meetings. "Lucas, you've been spending too much time with the pulse," Ethan said one evening, after Lucas snapped at a colleague over a minor mistake. "I'm fine," Lucas replied sharply. "I just need more time. I'm on the verge of something." "You're pushing yourself too hard." "The pulse, it amplifies emotions. You're not thinking clearly." Lucas shot him a look that sent a chill down Ethan's spine. "Maybe I'm the only one who is thinking clearly." "The pulse isn't just some scientific discovery, Ethan. It's alive. It's speaking to us." Ethan stared at his friend, realizing for the first time just how deeply the pulse had affected him. Lucas wasn't just fascinated by the pulse, he was consumed by it. "We need to step back," Ethan said quietly, trying to remain calm. "Just for a bit. We need to make sure we're approaching this with clear minds." Lucas shook his head. "You don't understand. The pulse is showing me things about myself, about the universe. I'm not backing down now." Ethan watched as Lucas stormed out of the room, a knot of dread forming in his chest. The pulse, for all its potential, was dangerous. It was tapping into something deep within them, and Ethan feared that they had only begun to scratch the surface of what it was capable of. The next morning, Ethan was woken by a frantic call from Naomi. "Lucas is missing," she said, her voice tight with panic. "He didn't show up for the morning meeting, and no one can get a hold of him. His phone's off." Ethan bolted out of bed, his heart racing. "Have you checked the observatory?" "I'm heading there now." Ethan threw on his clothes and rushed to the observatory. When he arrived, he found Naomi pacing outside, her face pale. "He's not here," she said, her voice barely a whisper. But Ethan followed her gaze to the open door of Lucas's office. Inside, the walls were covered with notes, diagrams, and data points, all connected by frenzied scribbles about the pulse. Ethan's stomach dropped as he stepped inside. Lucas had been tracking the pulse obsessively, far beyond what they had been working on as a team. There were strange symbols mixed in with the scientific data, as if Lucas had been trying to decipher some hidden message within the pulse. "Ethan, this is madness," Naomi said, her voice trembling. "He's lost it." Ethan didn't respond. He picked up one of Lucas's notebooks, flipping through the pages. The handwriting was increasingly erratic, the notes more and more incoherent. It was clear that Lucas had been unraveling for weeks, perhaps even months, and none of them had noticed. "We have to find him," Ethan said, his voice low and steady. "Before it's too late." Lucas was found 3 days later, wandering in the desert outside the city. He was disoriented, dehydrated, and muttering to himself about the pulse. Ethan and Naomi visited him in the hospital, but Lucas barely recognized them. His eyes were hollow, his body frail, as if the pulse had drained the life out of him. "He's not the same," Naomi whispered as they stood by Lucas's bedside. Ethan's heart ached as he looked at his friend. Lucas had been one of the brightest minds Ethan had ever worked with, and now he was reduced to a shell of himself. The pulse had taken him too far, pushed him to a place from which he might never return. In the aftermath of Lucas's collapse, Ethan made the decision to halt the research. He couldn't let the pulse claim anyone else. He gathered the team and explained that the risks were too great, that they needed to step away until they fully understood what they were dealing with. The decision was met with mixed reactions. Some of the team, including Naomi, agreed that it was the right choice. Others, like Marcus, were disappointed but understood the need for caution. But Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that the pulse wasn't finished with him yet. In the weeks that followed, Ethan tried to return to his normal life. He reconnected with Leah, visiting her more often and making an effort to be present in her life. They shared long conversations about art and science, and for the first time in years, Ethan felt like he was truly getting to know his daughter again. Yet the pulse remained in the back of his mind, a constant, steady rhythm that he couldn't ignore. Late at night, when the world was quiet, he would listen to the recordings he had made, feeling the pulse sync with his heartbeat. It was as if the universe itself was calling out to him, urging him to continue the work he had started. One evening, as Ethan sat alone in his study, Leah called him. "I've been thinking about your pulse," she said, her voice thoughtful. "You always talk about it like it's alive, like it's part of something bigger." Ethan smiled. "I suppose that's how it feels. It's more than just a signal. It's connected to us, in a way I still don't fully understand." Leah was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Maybe that's the point. Maybe it's not about understanding it. Maybe it's about feeling it." Ethan sat back in his chair, her words sinking in. Feeling it. That's what the pulse had been doing all along, resonating with human emotion, amplifying it, and reflecting it back. It wasn't something to be studied and dissected. It was something to be experienced. And in that moment, Ethan realized that the pulse wasn't just the heartbeat of the universe. It was the heartbeat of life itself. It connected everything, every star, every planet, every human being. It wasn't something to be controlled or feared. It was a reminder that they were all a part of something greater, something beautiful and infinite. Ethan closed his eyes and listened to the pulse, feeling it wash over him, calm and steady. He no longer needed to understand it. He simply needed to be with it, to let it guide him, just as it had guided him back to his daughter, to his own heart. The pulse beat on, a quiet rhythm in the vastness of space, reminding Ethan that life, like the universe, was a mystery that could never be fully understood or only felt.